Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome to the stage to talk about her memoir, Bonnie Greer, and to ask the questions, Steve Richards.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming along. I thought the way Bonnie and I would structure this, if that's okay with you, is I'll talk to Bonnie for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then it's open to you for questions for the remainder of the session. So, Bonnie, I thought I would begin, if that's okay, with actually something right at the back of the book, one of your acknowledgements. The book, I should say, is mainly set in your early life. It doesn't cover the period with which you'll be familiar with Bonnie here. It begins in Chicago. And you end by saying, as one of your acknowledgements, my hometown, Chicago, a place you never really leave, no matter how far you go and for how long. Now, given that by the end of the book, you're in New York, and we know that you now are in London, the United Kingdom, what do you mean by that about Chicago? Because this book is partly about Chicago and the way you experienced it.
Oh, thank you, Steve. That's a good question. And let me think about it for a second. Chicago is one of those places, and I think if you're attached to a city or space, it leaves a kind of sort of mark on you. Chicago is a very straight talking place, very plain talking place. There's a very strong working class ethic in it. There's also very strong racial divide in it. There's also a sense of the blues, which is very important for me as a kind of river that runs through my life. You know, the ethos, the feeling, the attitude. So in a sense, I've never left Chicago because Chicago is sort of where I come from. It's how I speak. I refuse to lose my accent, for instance, when I talk to people and they say, oh, it doesn't sound, you've been here for almost 30 years. Well, I deliberately refuse to have
it. It was a conscious decision.
It was a conscious, except I had to, except if I go back to Chicago, people ask me where I'm from. So, because they don't hear it. But I've consciously kept it, and I think it's a way of me keeping my feet on the ground. Also keeping myself, like Muddy Waters has a song where he says, never forget your inherit. Just remembering my people, how I grew up, the people who taught me, my teachers, and to see myself on a sojourn away from Chicago, but not ever really leaving it.
Yeah,
if that makes any sense.
And you've already made references to various pieces of music and so on. I want to ask you almost separately about how music and film and other things kind of transported you to other places. But early Chicago, you mentioned the race divide, which clearly you think is still an issue there. As you were being brought up, it was the overwhelming issue, wasn't it?
Yeah. I was born in '48, so I would have been a 10-year-old or 8-year-old as well during the time of the desegregation, the schools, Little Rock, all of that. And so I saw this on television. My community was all black because that's the way the divide is in Chicago, and still is.
Still is.
Chicago, the south side of Chicago where I grew up, is the largest African-American enclave in the United States. So, and not only in terms of the concentration of black people, particularly black working class people, but in sort of the concentration of our accents. Most of our people, my people, come from the Mississippi Delta, from Alabama, so we all sound alike as well. Even if people ask me when I first came here, do you come from the South? No, but my people come from the South. Because of segregation, your accent doesn't break out. So everybody sounds pretty much the same. So it's all of that kind of sort of cohesion, and that's a lot of what it is, actually.
And it comes across in your book as incredibly tough, actually. I mean, you don't romanticize it.
No.
You experience some really bleak things.
Yes.
You heard people being raped. You yourself felt that as a black person, you were treated by early boyfriends more as a body, etc.
Yeah.
At every point, it
Yes.
sounded tough, tough, tough.
Well, my dad was a factory worker. He worked at night so that we could go to Catholic school, which was the best kind of education that we could possibly get. He wasn't himself, he was baptized a Catholic because your fees would go down if you were baptized. So we were all baptized, duly baptized. But
It happens in England now.
yes, so it was the best schooling for us in our community. So Dad worked at night so that he could make enough money so that we could do that. And I think, and my mother was what they used to call in the 50s a housewife. So she was at home all the time. And so I grew up in a very stable, classically stable household. So a lot of things that were going on my community were going on around me. And because I was the type of child, and still am, who likes looking out, I could see and feel all those things, but they weren't happening inside. But I think that, as I say in the book, we lived in, for my first real place that I recall, other than the place my parents brought me back to when I was born, that was an apartment that we shared on the west side of Chicago, which is still a quite notorious gang neighborhood. And we were in a brownstone on the bottom floor that we shared with my father's sister, his baby sister, my aunt and uncle. And there was a little passageway between our house and the house next door, and it was where all the gang initiations took place. So I would go to sleep at night, and I like sleeping by the window, I still do, and I could hear everything. And, I was only 8, 9, 10 years old. I didn't know what I was listening to, but somewhere inside you know what you're listening to. And, I think it affected me. Also, those of you, women and men too, who came of age in the 60s and 70s, when you hear about all this, historical sex abuse, and I think younger people think, oh, what's that all about? I think a lot of us who are young women, particularly in the 70s, know what that was about. I mean, being chased around offices, having to be exposed to different things that now women are not subjected to. And so in a sense, growing up a girl, and the book is about being a girl who discovers certain things that society sees her as. So growing up in that era, women were more subjected to what now would be illegal. And I tell my younger women friends, they look at me like I'm crazy when I say, I would get trapped in lifts by my boss, or you go into the ladies' room and your boss would be in there, or this kind of stuff that happened in various movements that happened to you because you're a female. So I had to kind of move myself away from sort of that kind of place. And I didn't know about it until later because it was part of moving through. We have a place in France, and sometimes on French TV at night they play porn and soft, they call it erotic films. And I looked at one that was made in the 70s the other night, one of these erotic films. And I'd forgotten how women were treated in the 70s, what we were expected to do, expected to be. And you can see it, and I tell younger women, if you ever get hold of these films, you can look at the sort of attitude. And that's the kind of thing that I had to confront on top of being a black woman, where certain things were assumed about you, even by black people. My mother was very, very protective of us girls in particular. I wasn't allowed in a lot of places. I couldn't go unchaperoned on a date till I was 18 years old. And that was all to protect me from the stuff that's out there if you're a woman of color.
And you write a lot also about your father, who sounds very interesting. I mean, in a way, you started watching American news quite early on. I think you watched Walter Cronkite and people like that. And he was very interested and would have clearly developed more of an interest if he wasn't working nights. I think you're going to read a bit about him. So, and tell us briefly about that relationship, and then we'll move on to what happens next.
My dad was a man who believed, and I'll read about that, he believed in education as a liberation factor. Education was the most important thing. And he because of all the things that were happening. I mean, he was over in this country during World War II. He came over as part of the D-Day contingent. He turned 20 years old after the D-Day landings. And he was here. It was the first time he had been treated like a human being, even though he was in a segregated army. The Army of the United States was segregated, if you can believe they had fighting a war and maintaining segregation. I don't know how they did that. But anyway, they did. And so current events, we call current events and news, were very important to my father. So at 6 o'clock, when the news came on, he was gone because he'd be at work. But I knew the news came on at 5 o'clock with Walter Cronkite, who was sort of, there's no one equivalent in this country to Walter Cronkite in terms of the most important, if he said it was right, it was right. So the news and current affairs have always been important to me, always.
I can tell from your tweets. Actually,
yes, you read my tweets, all right? Right.
Anyway, you're going to read us, something about your father,
my dad.
or your dad.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Education was the way out, the way to beat them. And education just wasn't about getting a job, although that was important. No welfare folks for Dad. He believed purely and simply in learning for its own sake. They can't take everything from you. They can take everything from you but what you know. But the other side of the scholar was a free-living bon vivant. A man about town lived inside of my dad. He needed to be on his own, to withdraw from time to time. His inability to withdraw, to do that, was not only because he was too busy providing for a wife and 7 kids, but because he had no model of a black man who had lived the life of the mind and survived. He needed to be away from us and away from Mama to see the world that fascinated him. He kept his GI World War II D-Day French, much of which I don't think he could actually repeat in polite company. And when he finally did travel for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, he strode off the plane as sprightly as a teenager. He was an autodidact supreme, a man who read way above his schooling. He was devoted to the Encyclopedia Britannica, which he bought monthly from a door-to-door salesman. He bought those books for us and for himself. They made me come to see European history as it unfolded in its pages, Europe itself as a breath of fresh air, a haven. The illustrations of the statues in the British Museum were among his favorite. He could never have dreamt that I would become vice chair of that museum someday. But maybe he did. Maybe he saw it in those pages as we talked about Pliny and Euripides and Socrates. Maybe he knew. Because of those books and our talks, fleeting but intense, I came to understand that some things are better than others. Daddy taught me that Tolstoy is better than Tolkien, Michelangelo better than a Hallmark card illustration. This stance has narrowed my range, kept me out of the loop, made me deeply uncool, but I know what a classic is, and that there's no such thing as an instant one. He read the same articles over and over and showed me how even a piece of writing ripens with age, like the bourbon he liked to drink clandestinely. When, after he came to visit us in London, and David, my husband, introduced him to Scotch from Scotland, he finally knew what the good thing was. He took a bottle back to the South Side, to the neighbor next door, who simply stared at it in awe. David explained to them both that they were never to mix that with water, and Dad understood, and he never did. The rest, what he had before, was nothing to him by then. It was gone. For him, it wasn't about the best. It was about the true. Great art, great writing, great film, all of these things are very rare, he would tell me. And he said, too, you don't have to take substitutes until the good stuff comes along. You just keep with the good stuff. It'll never get tired. He may have narrowed my cultural palette. He may have made it impossible for me to enjoy the popular. I run away from it more than I run to it. He wasn't being a snob. Life's too short, he'd say. Go to the top. For me, he was right. The great work never gets tired. Daddy did not like embellishments. He was very spare and elegant. He got the best that he could afford, always. I have to tell you one little story about that. My dad was, I kind of think about him like the way Humphrey Bogart was. He had that sort of same stance. So here's my father. I finally get home. He's dying of cancer. He's laying on the bed that he shared with our mother, and very wizened, very tiny, you know, when you have that kind of cancer. And I was trying to hold my tears back because I thought, I'm not going to show. He would not want me to see my tears, because that's how he was, very cool, you know. So I came and everything, and I looked at him. I said, he said, so he could barely talk. He said, so you know what your job is? I said, no, Dad, what is it? He said, I want you to make sure. He said, open that closet. I opened the closet, and there was this incredible blue suit, beautiful blue suit with a tie, everything. He said, make sure I'm laid out in that. So I said, but Dad, he said, no ifs, ands, or buts. You know how to do my cuffs, everything. Make sure I'm laid out. That was the last thing he said to me. And my husband David was sitting right there. He wanted to make sure that David had his ring. So David wears his wedding ring.
You sounds amazing.
He was dude. He said, consider the source, he'd always say, which gave me the ability to objectively listen to anyone, no matter how prominent or famous they are. I'm not kowtowed by fame or erudition, because Daddy taught me what the bottom line is, the quality of the mind. The mind for him was an instrument, free of banality, free of others, always searching and discarding, honing, proving, testing. There was no going for the one with him, no ultimate answer. He implied to me, though he believed in God, that the bravest life is a life lived without a belief in a supreme being. To live life for its own sake, not out of fear or seeking a reward or even for love, secular or divine, just for life. He was self-confident in spite of all he had to go through, and I guess he gave that to me too. It's not arrogance, it's solitude. In other words, he taught me to spare my all. Thank you.
Right. No, he sounds like it is. He was obviously a big figure and features very heavily in the book. Also, as I said earlier, I think, in fact, you say at one point in the book that 1967 was a key year for you in all kinds of ways. Politics, Vietnam thing building up, some of the issues we've already discussed. But as I said at the beginning, music plays a big part in this book, clearly plays a big part in your kind of development. And we'll tell you mentioned the blues, I think, already. That features heavily. I think Grateful Dead, you idolize one member particularly, but you also Dylan, Beatles.
Oh, yeah,
there's a
all
kind
that
of
stuff.
soundtrack to the book.
Motown, everything.
Motown.
Yeah.
Tell us about that and how that kind of defined you partly in this period, or you took inspiration from the music of that time.
Well, when I was growing up on the West Side, when I was about 8 years old, we lived next door to a woman by the name of Mildred. I'll never forget her. She was a wild woman, real wild. My mother would call country woman. Talk loud. She was always out on the front porch. Bad thing to do for a Southern black woman. You ain't on the front porch, okay? So Mildred was on the front steps talking loud. My mother just detested that, and she had 2 kids who were our friends. And she was had this guy come around to visit her on Saturday. We didn't ask too many questions. And he drove a big pink panel truck. It was shocking pink. And he parked it right in the street. And for my mother, it was quite bourgeois, quite, she was appalled. I mean, and particularly because the guy would serenade Mildred on the back porch with his guitar. And, my mother was like, never be on the front. If you're a Southern black person, you have to be very proper, never talk loud, never on the front porch, never talking in the street. You go in the garden, you talk back there, keep your voice down. And here's Mildred with this dude strumming in the back. So, and I loved his voice. I would sit on our steps. On the back, and I listened to him. He was my first real singer. And my mother said, oh, God, he goes again, and he'd just be singing the blues. She'd say, and his name, I hate his name. Who'd ever call himself Muddy Waters, And I said, oh, Muddy Waters, I said, I love that name. I said, it's a really beautiful name. He said, Muddy Waters, what is... So I didn't know that that was any big deal until I came to London about 30 years later, and I was in a pub. No, actually, I was up here. I was in Edinburgh for the Edinburgh Festival. And I was with some friends, and I said, oh, yeah, well, when I was growing up, I used to live next door to Muddy Waters. The whole place went dead quiet. So it's Muddy Waters. My father collected jazz in those beautiful old 78s. So I listened to a lot of Ahmad Jamal. I listened to a lot of Ornette Coleman. He didn't like big band, but he liked that sort of real kind of ornate kind of jazz. And then, of course, there was transistor radios in those days, so I listened to a lot of Motown. I grew up in Chicago, so that was Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions. We lived on the West Side, so there was still a bit of that 50s thing going on, so there was a lot of doo-wops. There were doo-wop competitions on the street. My father collected classical music through the Reader's Digest, so I heard a lot of English classical music. I didn't know what it was, but we listened to Greensleeves, Rimsky-Korsakov. I heard a lot of that. And then I remember one day, we had a DJ called Herb Kent, the Cool Gent. He's still alive, this dude is still alive. And he said, we were walking down the street with the transistors to our ear, and he said, now I'm going to play you something that's going to be really unusual. And we thought, okay, right, a New Temptations record. Then I heard this guitar go, dang, da 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 dang, da 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 dang, da. But we thought, what is that? And it was the Beatles. And we were just really, my little crowd, we were shocked that this music had sort of intruded our space. But the reason I bring up music, and of course the 70s, not only soul, but the music of the movement. So Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, all the women's music that was coming up, particularly Laura Nyro, Nina Simone, Aretha. But the reason why all this matters is because I'm a synesthete. And so my whole connection with reality is through music. I hear music all the time. So the way that I was able to remember the things that I remembered was through sort of listening to a song, and then the whole story would open up. So the book is built around songs, and it's an autobiography in that these things happened, but it's more of a memoir, and that I'm remembering things, and I'm remembering through the music that I love.
In fact, you call one entire section Low, don't you?
Yes, yes.
And then the David Bowie Berlin period.
Exactly.
And all the rest of it. It's extraordinary range of musical references. We're going to sort of fast forward so you've got time for questions. Yes. So you develop through this range and friends that you meet in Chicago. You sort of get into arty Chicago, and then ultimately you go to New York. And tell us about your impressions of New York. You've had Chicago, and then you go there. And in fact, the book ends with one of your friends basically saying that you can stay for a bit longer.
Yes,
so you're clearly going to spend some time in New York.
Yes.
Extraordinary contrast, really, with Chicago.
Chicago is, first of all, it's the place I grew up. So it's where wherever your childhood is, it's where your childhood is. And I think you either go back there or you move away from it. It's always kind of there. New York, first of all, Chicago is very flat. So whenever I go home to see my mom, I just have to sort of marvel at how flat it is. It's a completely flat plain. So and everything is sort of built on a grid, and it's very straight. New York is hills, first of all, they're gradations. The buildings were older in many ways, that were still around. There was more of a mix of black community. So I would meet people who were from the Caribbean, who were from Africa. You didn't meet those people in Chicago at the time that I was growing up. So the whole Catholicity of life opened itself up for me in Chicago. And of course there was a theater. And there was the opportunity to really know if I was any good at the theater. You eventually, you have to go to New York in those days to find out. So it was for me.
You trained in the theatre there, didn't you?
I mean, formally got more involved in it, and it was always for me a process of moving eastward toward the rising sun to see what was there, and so this is a move east as well.
What you don't get a sense of in your book is, you know how you read some memoirs and you get a sense from the age, I don't know, if you read the Beatles or some politicians, from 5 they were going to be prime minister or a rock band. I mean, you say at one point in your memoir you started writing age 9.
Yes.
But towards the end you conclude that you do not want to be a professional writer, that you feel that that it's stifling in some respects. And then you do the theatre thing. And so I get the impression at this point, when it ends and you're still in New York, you haven't come here yet, you haven't necessarily formed a clear view of what you emphatically regard as your vocation, or do you think you had done by then?
Well, I've always written. I've always been a writer. And so I think sometimes if you do things as a child and you're not in a conservatory where somebody says, this is what you are, go play that piano, writing for me has always been play. And so I don't have and there's also sort of been something, I guess, icky for a long time about taking money for it. Because it was, even though Samuel Johnson said anybody but a blockhead would write not for money. But I didn't and still don't have a connection with it and livelihood because I did it for so long. I mean, I wrote at such an early age, I wrote all the school plays. I did all the journalism in high school and wrote poetry. So it was always, that's something I can do. What am I supposed to really be doing? And I think I still feel that way, even at this point in my life. But I think now at this point in my life, I'm happy that I feel that way, in a sense, because I see my friends go on the normal trajectory of life, and they're now at the point where they've got grown kids, they're grandparents, and the system isn't built for us to be where we are now.
Yeah.
We have outlived every system that has been built to take care of us. So now people who are in their 50s and 60s and early 70s, we're in a kind of place that human beings have never been in before. In terms of, what do we can actually say, now what do I want to do? So I think my life has prepared me to be able to feel that way all the time. It's scary and it's weird sometimes, but it's how my life is.
And just one final one for me, then we'll open it up. Obviously, as I said, that you end it in New York, and in fact, the cultural references, as you'll get from our discussion, are nearly all American. I think the Beatles get in there, and Bowie, but he was in Berlin by then anyway.
Yes.
So it did make me wonder at the end, and you're going to write another one, I think. Just out of interest, why did you end up in England? Because this is so American. And yet you've been in England, how many years did you say?
I've been almost 30.
Just
London.
Just briefly, give us a hint of volume to why did you end up here when this is so American?
There were 3 things. One is the Black Theater Cooperative came to New York with a play, and I had never seen Black people, and it's so diverse. Never met Asian people, never, not really. And because that's how segregated America is. And the diversity of Black people in this country was amazing to me, and I wanted to learn more about it. The other thing is I felt I liked English fashion a lot. I liked the sort of British sort of sense of being individual, much more so than Americans are, deeply, maybe even eccentricity. And I loved British theater. I came here with a piece in '86, and that's how I came to sort of get myself attached. But British theater was at the time innovative, it was dangerous, it was poor, in the sense that Brecht talks about it, very, very much about coming from the people. Women were making theater that they weren't making in the United States. Black people were making theater they weren't making in the United States. Very edgy, dangerous stuff. And I really thought that's where I needed to be.
Fascinating. Right, well, got time for questions now. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you put your hand up, and we'll get going with some questions. Who'd like to start, please? I'll carry on if you want, but here, yeah. If you just wait for the mic, thank you.
Oh, I think they're recording.
Yeah.
Hello?
Hello.
Well, One plays those word association games whereby if I say blue, you say green. If I say childhood,
Childhood is chaos. And that's because mainly my childhood was about my mother trying to keep me contained because she knew the community I was growing up in. I didn't know anything about it. I was a kid who wanted to go knock on every door and say, hello, who are you? And can I go back in your garden and see what's going on? And I was always extremely curious. My mother said that when I was 4 years old, she had a friend. Maybe this lady was pregnant, I don't know. But her dress stuck out in the front. And I said to my mother, because I spoke very early, I said, Mommy, why is her dress sticking out? And Mother said, shh. And I said, but Mommy, why is her dress sticking out like that? And my mother said, shh. And then, you know how when your mom, I don't have any children, but I've raised a lot of children. And you know how your mom, when you suddenly, that danger is kind of quiet, when you think, uh-oh. And my mother looked around, and I was on my knees, and I had my head up underneath this lady's dress, trying to see why her dress was sticking out, because nobody would tell me. And I'm still like that. So I think my mother's whole job was to keep me pinned down, and I couldn't understand why. So it was very chaotic for me, I think. Very chaotic.
Okay, interesting question.
That was.
The way of phrasing it. There and then there. Yes.
I like that, actually.
Yes.
I really do.
We usually only see you on press preview in front of the cameras on Sky News. Is that something you might consider doing more of in front of the camera?
If they ask me, you know, they have to ask you. They ask you, you know, and then you do it. But the thing is, I think I'm an anomaly. And I'm coming to understand that very strange, you know, because I didn't obviously grow up here, and I haven't become British, although I have British nationality for a long time. But you know, I think for some producers, where do I come from? And so it's one of the reasons why my publisher asked me to write the book, to talk about that a little bit. But I think I'm in a very strange place. So people will ask me to come on, and I feel it's my duty to just say what I need to say, because what's the purpose? There's no other reason.
But going back to the childhood and Cronkite, you've got a genuine fascination with news and current
Absolutely,
affairs.
I always have.
Comes across on that Sky
Always
thing,
have.
and as I say on your tweets. Mark, behind you.
Hi.
Hi, Mark.
I just wanted to know, when was the first time you heard the name Barack Obama, and what do you think of his presidency?
I would be very happy to say that. Well, I was walking, we live near Soho, David and I was walking with a young black guy from Harvard. And I'm telling you he's black because the president is a graduate of Harvard Law, and he, David Lammy, they all have a little kind of society. So he met Barack Obama. So he said, you know, this was 2007. He said, the person you need to get behind is a senator from Illinois named Barack Obama. Now, when I was coming up in the 60s, one of the things that was the vogue, if you're African American, you changed your name. So, you know, you were Leroy Jones, you became Amiri Baraka. So the first thing I said was, so what's his real name? Nobody's called Barack Obama, who is, comes from Illinois. Then I thought that it was crap. That was bullshit. Nobody's called Barack Obama. So I just didn't. I was not up for it. And I listened to his voice. He didn't have any of the, he was from Chicago. That's where he met Michelle. But he doesn't have the Chicago accent. So inside me, I didn't hear it. I thought, where is this dude from? What's it about here? Because he didn't have the accent, even though he kept talking about Chicago. He didn't have a Chicago accent. Then I read that he grew up in Hawaii, and I went, number one down. That's bad. It's a surfer dude, okay? And, you know, exactly. So, you know, I'm thinking black surfer dude called Barack Obama. And then I saw Michelle in Ohio stand up. Michelle's from the same part of town as me. I heard her voice. It's very visceral. I said, right, if he married this woman, he's good, okay? That was the first thing I thought.
Yeah.
Then, but still, I was a Hillary person because Hillary's my generation. I thought the ceiling was the female. It still is. And I thought, Hillary, I'm with Hillary. Then Hillary messed up in about July when she started pressing the right-wing white thing. That was our desperation. That was beneath her. That pissed me off. And I thought, okay, no more Hillary. And then I didn't really react to Barack Obama. I wrote about this in The Guardian. Didn't do anything for me until he came off Air Force One when he was president-elect. And I thought, oh my God, I've lived long enough to see a black man come down those stairs, president of the United States. I thought about my father, my mommy, everything. I have never had high expectations of Barack Obama because you do not become president of the United States if you're a revolutionary. You do not become president of the United States if you're actually going to change things fundamentally. You don't get that far. You don't get there. You just don't get there. They don't let you get there. I'm not old enough to remember Adlai Stevenson, people who really tried to be president. You don't get there. So I knew where Barack Obama, where he was seated. And so therefore for me, there isn't any disappointment because I know you don't get where he is. But I think the thing that's the most dangerous, and I've written about this, and I think we need to understand this on this side of the water, is there's been a concerted effort ever since he was inaugurated to destroy him. Either literally, but certainly figuratively, they've castrated him and Eric Holder. So there is only so much this man can do. I mean, young black kids, if I was 18 years old now, I wouldn't understand him at all. I wouldn't get it. I wouldn't know what he was doing. I wouldn't know why he couldn't come out about Ferguson. I wouldn't understand him. But I'm old enough to know that if you're the only black person in the room, there's certain things that you have to maintain to make sure that the door stays open. And Barack Obama has had to keep a lot of stuff quiet in order to get through this presidency, because what the right has tried to do and what racists have tried to do in America is make this an illegitimate presidency, and therefore the people who voted for him are illegitimate. I think the fact that he's changed the American healthcare system is revolutionary. It will go down in history. I think that he was able to affect the pullout of Iraq. He did it. But because he's only the chief executive, he can only work through executive orders, as you know, Mark, and that's not where a president wants to be. He can't do certain things. But I think within the pen that the House has put him into, and the right-wing press, I think he's done an amazing job. I think he's certainly changed healthcare system. And my mother's in a nursing home with Alzheimer's, so I'm getting very much clued into what the healthcare system is in the United States. He's totally revolutionized that. So what he's done is made it possible so that when we look at the Oval Office again, we're not going to see the prototype there. Anybody can sit behind that desk. And he's the person who took the hit. So I think he's going to go down in history, and I hope I live long enough to see his presidency vindicated, because after that, after him, we're going to have a woman, we're going to have a Jewish person, we're going to have a Latino. That's all open now. It's all open because he and Michelle broke it open. And always with pioneers, they fall down at the first hurdle, and then it's the other folks. That's what Dr. King taught me. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody from that side of the room? At the back there. Yeah.
I must begin by saying, Bonnie, that I fell in love with your literature a long time ago.
Oh, thank you.
Today I just fell in love with you.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely amazing.
It's okay, David,
Absolutely
right? David says it's all right.
My question is a follow-up from the previous one. I wonder if you saw Dr. Cornel West's criticizing the disconnect between American politics and the real life of African Americans in Newsnight a couple of days, some days ago. And I wonder what you have to say about his very sharp criticism.
Well, it amuses me when people bring on Cornel West on Newsnight. I think that's actually kind of funny. First of all, Cornel West is a genius, okay? He's a hip-hop man of the street. He's a genius. The guy is a genius. He's a jazz man. So he lives off in there somewhere. He's off there. He's absolutely correct in everything he says, but he don't make nothing for real life. See, so Dr. West is he is intellectual in the highest notion. So Newsnight will put Cornel West on because Dr. West is amusing, he's brilliant, but Dr. West doesn't give you any solutions because that's not what he's about. He's about analyzing the situation. A lot of young people love Dr. West because he's, the way he looks, the way he speaks. The right likes Dr. West too. And that's my only criticism of Cornel, who I absolutely adore. But my only thing is he leaves the door open because he's so much into his own vibe and his way of explaining that the right wing actually picks up on what Cornel West says and throws it back into these young people's faces. And that's not any good. He criticizes the president, and he ain't wrong, but it's counterproductive to what he's trying to say because the majority of people don't live on the plane that Cornel lives on. He's sort of like one of these jazz geniuses that you see who stride onto the stage. They don't actually communicate with anybody. And there's 5 minutes where you think, this is incredible. And then the other 95 is like, well, what can I do with this? I'm walking out the room and I just heard a riff that was fantastic, but I can't hum it. Okay, I can't remember it because it's too complex. That's Cornel's place in the world, but Cornel is not useful. And I think what these young people need now is usefulness. They need somebody who is useful. They've broken down the president, so he can't be of use to anybody. But what young people need to have now is something they can use. And Cornel isn't that person. And that's why Newsnight had him on there, because he ain't of use. Even though I love him.
Yeah, this might be the last
sense,
question, I'm
right?
afraid. Yeah, the guy in the middle, because we haven't had people from this section. Yeah.
God, this is fun.
Do you have a favourite Bob Dylan song? And if
favorite?
so, Bob Dylan song? And if so, what is the name of the song and why is it your favourite?
I can only think of the riff where I like Highway, what is it, Highway 50?
Highway 61
Revisited. I like that whole sort of trajectory. I tell you something even deep about what Bob Dylan did. Do you know the Four Tops? Do you know their music? Do you know the song Bernadette? Listen to Bernadette. Listen to the middle of Bernadette, where he sings about Bernadette. And Levi Stubbs takes Bob Dylan's voice and retools it right through the whole soul medley. And Bob Dylan, when I first heard him, one of the reasons that I know when somebody is a genius is when they sound off key. And I first heard Bob Dylan when I was washing dishes. I was 12 years old and I thought he was on TV and I thought this man is singing off key. And that's how I knew he was great. It's that whole Highway 61. And I like, there's one where he sings about being crazy. There's something about being crazy. They all mesh together for me. But, of course,
there's a few where he goes on.
Yeah,
about
it's where
being
he
crazy.
goes on. But he, I learned later that he was remaking Arlo Guthrie. Yeah. And so I started going back to listening to Depression era music from the 30s. So Bob Dylan led me back there. And he was okay when he went electric. I didn't mind. I thought it was good.
Well, look, Bonnie, thanks so much for coming in and talking about your book, which is a terrific read. I think we've got a sense of it over the last hour, but it's only a sense, and I assume you'll be signing copies. I don't know what the arrangement is, but I'm sure that will be arranged. Bonnie, thanks very
Thank
much
you,
indeed for
Fitzy.
coming
Thank
on.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.